Reuben Lawson had never cared much for conformity. While most people his age were slowly retreating into routines of comfort and predictability, he had spent the last 2 decades quietly investing in remote land parcels, advising industrial clients on disaster risk protocols, and living out of suitcases and hard cases, never really calling any one place home. It wasn't that he was running from anything. It was simply that stability had never presented itself in a way he found appealing, until he stood on the back deck of a modest house in North Willow Bend, a tree-lined suburb wrapped in the illusion of peace and order. From the very beginning, Reuben knew this neighborhood wouldn't be easy. A few polite exchanges with the locals, the tight smiles and nods that barely masked territorial surveillance, were all he needed to confirm what he'd already assumed. This was the kind of place where invisible rules mattered more than written ones, where the greatest sins were committed not out of malice but out of desperate adherence to imagined order. The council, though no one called them that directly, operated with the tone of a homeowners association, but none of the legal transparency. Decisions were made, not documented. Agreements were expected, not negotiated. Still, Reuben wasn't here to make waves. The property, which he had purchased through an estate sale, came with a half-acre backyard, thick soil, and a natural gradient that sloped gently away from the house. To Reuben, it wasn't just a lawn. It was space. And with space came the opportunity to finally construct something he'd carried in his mind for years. A personal fire circle, designed not as some kitschy outdoor grill or suburban fire pit, but a stone-lined basin inspired by the Icelandic. Geothermal pools and desert formations he'd encountered during consultancy projects in the Arctic and American Southwest. This was meant to be a tribute to memory, not spectacle. A quiet, fire-safe construction using compressed lava rock, tempered glass, and steel vents to control airflow. He'd built it himself over the course of 2 weekends, never disturbing the neighbors, and carefully following municipal codes down to the soil pH displacement. He never hosted a party. He never sent out invitations or lit the fire casually. When he completed it, Reuben simply sat by it one evening with a thermos of black tea and watched the gas-fed flames spiral and settle. It was silent, functional, intentional, everything he valued. Then came Karen Ashley. She had introduced herself 4 days after the fire circle was completed, wearing a navy windbreaker with the neighborhood's unofficial crest and leading 2 small poodles on retractable leashes. Her voice carried that fixed pitch of someone used to being listened to and obeyed, and she didn't so much greet Reuben as evaluate him. She looked past him toward the backyard, raised an eyebrow, and tilted her head. "You're the new resident on Lot 27B, correct?" she asked. Reuben nodded, keeping his voice neutral. "That's right. And that would be a recreational fire element, I assume?" It's a closed-vent fire circle, professionally grounded and within code. It's decorative. "I don't burn wood." "I see." She gave a smile that was somehow both polite and dismissive. "It's just that we tend to prefer cohesive visuals along the back properties. Nothing too evocative. Uniformity keeps things peaceful, wouldn't you agree?" "I suppose that depends on what peace means to you," Reuben answered, then sipped his tea and walked back into the house. That should have been the end of it. But in places like North Willow Bend, nothing ends that quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, Reuben noticed subtle changes. A drone flew unusually low one morning, then vanished behind Karen's porch roof. A surveyor's stake, which Reuben had removed months ago during his initial soil testing, reappeared near the corner of his fence, freshly painted. Someone began leaving folded notices in his mailbox, unsigned neighborhood updates, reminding residents to report non-standard landscaping or exterior installations. No names, no citations, just passive threats layered in etiquette. Still, Reuben did not react. He documented everything, scanned every note into a secure drive, and carried on. Then, on a cool Thursday morning, After returning from the hardware store, he walked into his backyard and froze. The fire circle was gone. Not vandalized, not scorched, not smashed. Gone. Excavated with surgical precision. The basalt stones had been unstacked and carried away. The gravel pit beneath had been filled with fresh soil and sod, unnaturally green, as if it had been rolled out like a carpet. A note was pinned to a stake in the center of the space. Unauthorized structure removed. Standard yard restoration, courtesy of District Landscaping Services. There was no phone number, no date, no contractor name. Reuben didn't move for a full 5 minutes. He simply stared at the place where the circle had been. He took a deep breath, then turned around and re-entered his house. He made no calls. He filed no report. Instead, he opened his files, pulled up the yard schematics he had submitted for permit inquiry months ago, and re-read the confirmation email that acknowledged no external permit was required for non-flammable, permanent decorative features under a certain square footage. The rules were on his side. The law, if called upon, would be too. But Reuben knew better. This wasn't about legality. It was about control. And control had nothing to do with rules, only with perception. Whoever had ordered the removal of his fire circle had done so not because it was dangerous or disruptive, but because it symbolized something they couldn't command. He walked back out onto the porch with a legal pad, a pen, and a portable chair. Sitting exactly where he had on the first night the fire circle burned, he began to sketch. Not a plan. Not yet. Just thoughts. Just possibilities. One of the sketches he drew was a circle. Larger, more precise, and not on his property. He didn't know if he would follow through. Not yet. But if someone wanted a uniform neighborhood, they had just made the mistake of assuming he didn't know how to play by their rules better than they did. As the sun sank behind the pines and the sky faded to a dense violet, Reuben stayed seated, watching the dark patch of grass where his fire circle used to be. For now, it was just grass. But soon it would become something else. Not a protest. Not a spectacle. A message. One they wouldn't be able to mow over. Not this time. Reuben did not react immediately. He understood that retaliation born from emotion almost always spiraled into error. Instead, he spent the following 2 days doing what he did best, documenting, verifying, and staying absolutely silent. He took new photos of the altered yard, carefully marking the subtle irregularities. How the replacement sod didn't match the surrounding turf, how the soil had been overly compacted from machinery weight, how the topographic slope had been slightly altered in a way that hinted at amateur restoration. Then he compared the dimensions of the missing circle with the current state of the ground. It was off by several inches, just enough to reveal that whoever removed the fire circle had done so quickly, with neither finesse nor full understanding of what they were dismantling. Rather than making demands, Reuben made inquiries. He filed a formal request to the Neighborhood Liaison Office, the bureaucratic face of the district's residential council, asking for documentation of the removal order. He referenced property boundaries, zoning allowances, and municipal codes that did not require permits for low-impact outdoor installations under specific size and fuel classifications. The reply came 3 days later, unsigned, but with the insignia of the Beautification and Compliance Committee, a sub-body of the council Reuben had not previously encountered in any official capacity. Hickneb. The email was brisk, bordering on condescending, stating that temporary landscaping corrections had been implemented following multiple visual concerns submitted by residents, and that restorative measures were deemed necessary to align neighborhood presentation with established district norms. No documentation was attached. No citations, no mention of prior warnings, formal votes, or due process. Reuben knew this type of language. He had seen it in boardrooms and military risk audits. phrases designed to simulate authority while obscuring accountability. He didn't respond. Instead, he printed the email, highlighted 3 vague phrases, and mailed it to his property attorney along with a handwritten note. Does this language justify entry without consent? He wasn't interested in filing a lawsuit. Not yet. But he wanted someone in the legal world to see the cracks forming. If this moved further, he'd need a documented trail of caution and prudence. What struck Reuben most was not the destruction itself, but the clinical certainty with which it had been done. This wasn't graffiti. It wasn't petty vandalism. It was coordinated, sanctioned, and likely executed with the approval, or at least the indifference, of more than one individual in power. He had underestimated how tightly the social machinery of the neighborhood operated and how far they were willing to go to preserve their illusion of aesthetic unity. Over the next week, Reuben observed subtle behavioral shifts among his neighbors. People who used to nod or wave now turned their backs or adjusted their routines to avoid crossing paths. Lawn workers, who usually moved briskly from house to house, lingered longer near his fence, glancing at his property with a mixture of curiosity and caution. One morning, a delivery driver stopped at the end of his driveway, checked a note taped to the steering wheel, and drove off without placing the package. When Reuben tracked the delivery online, it had been marked undeliverable, access restricted. He submitted a support ticket, and the package reappeared 2 days later, this time opened, resealed with clear tape, and showing signs of being handled. Things were shifting in ways he couldn't yet quantify. There was no one overt act he could pin down, but the accumulation of small irregularities painted a clear picture. He was being softened, pressured by isolation and inconvenience. Someone wanted him frustrated enough to make a mistake. He refused to give them that satisfaction. It was during one of these quiet evenings, while standing in the middle of his now blank backyard, that Reuben received a call from a name he didn't recognize. Troy Denslow. The man introduced himself cautiously, stating he lived 5 houses down and had been following the situation from a distance. He wasn't one for drama, he said, but there were some things a person just couldn't ignore. They met the next afternoon, not at Reuben's house, but in the rear section of Troy's garage away from street visibility. Troy was a precise, soft-spoken man in his late 60s, the type who wore pressed polo shirts even when doing yard work. He didn't speak until he closed the garage door and turned on a small oscillating fan, more for ambient noise than comfort. Then he opened a filing box and removed a printed letter marked with the Beautification and Compliance Committee's logo. "I got this last year," Troy said, handing it to Reuben. "They told me my porch planters were uncharacteristically textured. That's what they called them. I ignored it. A month later, I came home to find them gone, replaced by uniform fiberglass pots I never purchased. When I complained, they sent me an invoice, said the change was approved in my absence at a seasonal vote. I was out of town for work. They didn't care." Reuben studied the letter. The wording was nearly identical to the email he had received, vague, unchallenged, carefully constructed. It wasn't a fluke, it was a pattern. "Why tell me this now?" Reuben asked. Troy shrugged. "Because I saw what they did to your yard. Because I know you didn't overreact. And because I think they're escalating." Reuben didn't ask for help. He didn't need allies. What he needed was data, and Troy had just confirmed what he suspected. There was a standing pattern of unauthorized modifications done under the veil of compliance, justified by silent consensus, and executed without recourse. That night, Reuben reviewed every city ordinance related to residential property alteration, focusing on keywords like emergency, aesthetic mandate, and community corrective action. It became clear that while the council operated under procedural assumptions, they rarely aligned with enforceable law. Most of their actions were couched in discretionary language that only worked because no one had ever challenged them. At 3 a.m, Reuben drafted a single-page inquiry and submitted it to the district zoning office under the Freedom of Information Act. requesting records of any complaints, votes, or decisions related to Lot 27B within the last 90 days. He knew it might take weeks for a response, but the request itself was a signal. Someone would see it. Someone would take notice. Still, he didn't wait. He began conceptualizing something, quietly, methodically. Not revenge, not defiance. A mirror. If his original fire circle had been a personal sanctuary, this next design would be something else entirely. It would be tactical, visible, symbolic, and it wouldn't sit in his backyard. Reuben didn't believe in escalating without purpose. But he understood leverage. He understood optics. And if the council wanted control so badly, then perhaps it was time they saw what control really looked like when used with discipline, precision, and a complete understanding of the rules they so casually abused. Reuben had spent most of his career advising others how to recognize patterns. The slow, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior or infrastructure that signaled a system beginning to strain. This time, though, he wasn't an observer on the outside. He was embedded in the very mechanism he was studying, targeted, isolated, and now quietly boxed in. The pressure from the neighborhood wasn't coming in the form of direct threats or loud accusations. It was granular, calculated. It came in through adjustments in delivery routes, vague citations tucked inside community newsletters, and offhand remarks at the edges of walkways, always said just loud enough for him to hear, but never directed at him. And then, of course, came the unannounced visits. It began innocuously, almost comically. A man in a reflective vest walked into Reuben's driveway one morning holding a clipboard and stated, with no introduction, that he was here to assess the drainage slope along the northern fence. Reuben stood still, watching him, then asked if the man had documentation or a work order. The man hesitated, then gave a well-rehearsed explanation about routine district inspections, mumbling vaguely about erosion controls and community thresholds. Reuben didn't argue. He simply asked him to wait, walked inside, and returned 2 minutes later with his phone recording in one hand and a copy of his title deed in the other. The man left without saying another word. But it didn't end there. Over the next 5 days, 3 separate technicians arrived at different times. One claimed he was checking utility access points, another said he was updating neighborhood grid maps, and a third, this one particularly clumsy, knocked on Reuben's door, asking if there was a septic tank under his vegetable beds. Reuben never raised his voice. He took photos. He asked questions. He forwarded each incident to the zoning department with timestamps and a formal request for clarification. He received no reply. What he did receive, however, was a letter, slid under his front door with no postmark. It bore the same letterhead as the previous compliance messages, stamped with the District Beautification Council's emblem, and carried the following statement. Your continued refusal to cooperate with standard community access protocols has been noted. Further obstruction may result in official citation under Article 8, Section B, Paragraph 3. Reuben didn't know whether to laugh or grind his teeth. Section B of what? There was no reference document, no name, no actionable process. It was the language of invented authority. That same evening, after he returned from a meeting with a real attorney who confirmed, yet again, that the council's structure had no statutory enforcement power beyond code violations explicitly defined in the city's planning office, Reuben found his side gate open. It wasn't broken, forced, or damaged. It was simply unlocked and left ajar. The latch had been placed deliberately to suggest nothing had happened, but Reuben had installed a tension wire just the week before, a small wire designed to remain taut when the gate was sealed. That wire was now dangling, tensionless, curled like a sleeping snake. Someone had come in. He checked his backyard, careful not to disturb anything. The mulch under the raised beds looked recently disturbed, the soil compressed by a different set of shoes than his own. No tracks, no obvious signs. But a half-dozen of his outdoor planters had been slightly rotated, their alignment broken from the straight lines he always maintained. It was a signal, a quiet message. They had entered, and they wanted him to know. Rather than panic or call the police, Reuben pulled the pressure sensors from his garage shelf and got to work. He didn't use cameras. Those could be blocked or manipulated. He relied on what he trusted: silent systems, buried sensors, and passive trip alerts linked to a private data node he ran from his attic. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with a notepad, making columns of activity, estimated timestamps, and notes on how long the intrusions had taken. If they came back, he wanted a full behavioral profile. At 3:42 a.m., the system pinged. Pressure at the northeast corner, then again at the western edge by the fence line. No motion detected. Reuben hadn't armed the lights yet, but the sequence told him everything. 2 individuals, walking separately, pacing the yard at measured intervals. Not random, not bored teenagers. It was a perimeter walk, a rehearsal. He didn't intervene. He waited. They left after 5 minutes. The sensors went still. By morning, Reuben had made 2 decisions. The first, it was no longer sufficient to play by the rules they offered. The second, he would use the next scheduled community meeting to draw a line they couldn't easily erase. The following Monday, he submitted a request through the official neighborhood portal for a temporary installation permit. The form was laughably vague, designed more for discouragement than clarity, but Reuben filled it out meticulously. He described his proposed temporary decorative element in neutral, technical language. A fixed position, non-combustible artistic structure inspired by regional fire safety awareness campaigns. He attached design mock-ups, detailed specs, and a signed affidavit from a structural engineer confirming no risk of combustion, visibility obstruction, or code violation. He got no response. So he printed the request, notarized it, and hand-delivered it to the district office. Then he waited. 2 days before the meeting, an email arrived. It didn't approve the installation. It didn't reject it either. It simply said, pending further discussion with the Oversight Subcommittee, interim actions at applicant discretion, assuming full compliance with district safety protocols. In other words, no one wanted to take responsibility. Perfect. Reuben spent the next 24 hours building. The installation was elegant, minimalist, and unmistakably symbolic. A raised circle of dark gravel, ringed by cold steel and filled with a reflective aluminum basin layered with black obsidian shards. In the center, rather than flames, he placed a solar-powered ring light, buried beneath a translucent sheet of polycarbonate etched with geometric fire patterns. During the day, it looked dormant. At dusk, the lights would activate, casting orange-red reflections across the metal and gravel. He didn't place it in his yard. He installed it, legally, on the edge of the community center parking lot, directly within the boundaries marked for temporary exhibits and event structures. He used stakes, flag markers, and even placed a laminated card on a pedestal. Temporary exhibit. Symbolic structures in suburban space. Approved and notified. It was subtle, but it wasn't invisible. The evening of the meeting arrived with more tension than usual. Reuben wore a neutral gray windbreaker, carried no bag, and entered the community room quietly. Karen Ashley was already there, speaking to 2 other residents in low tones, eyes darting toward the windows. When Reuben entered, her voice faltered. He took a seat near the rear and said nothing. Minutes later, someone announced a small fire in the lot. They all rushed outside. There was no fire, just Reuben's installation, now fully illuminated under the early evening sky, glowing gently like a silent warning. Karen walked toward it, face tight. She read the laminated card. She looked back at Reuben. He said nothing. The meeting continued indoors, but no one could quite look away. A few took photos. A few whispered. Someone made a joke about council-approved art. But Karen said nothing for the rest of the night. Reuben had not restored his fire circle. He had moved it into their territory, lit it in their shadow, and dared them to define it. The escalation had begun, and, for once, it wasn't hidden. The following days passed with an unnatural quiet that made Reuben even more alert. No retaliation came. No complaints, no letters, not even the usual passive-aggressive flyers about neighborhood decorum. It was as if the entire district had entered a holding pattern, waiting to see who would make the next move. He knew better than to mistake the silence for surrender. It was deliberation, a pause before a more calculated response. Still, the absence of immediate fallout gave him room to observe the subtle shifts now playing out among the neighbors themselves. A few people nodded more openly when they saw him. One man, previously aloof, paused during his morning jog just long enough to murmur, "That was bold," before jogging off again without making eye contact. A woman 2 streets over left a note in his mailbox with no return name, just 4 words scrawled in blue ink. "They did it to us." He archived everything but engaged with nothing. He continued his routines, spent his mornings reviewing consultant reports, and tended to his property in silence. And yet, beneath the surface, Reuben was gathering pressure. The fire installation had not been a declaration of war. It had been a controlled detonation, a test of boundaries. And he had learned exactly what he needed to know. The council operated like a club whose authority hinged on perception. The moment someone pushed against their rituals with even modest legitimacy, they became unsure, fragmented. Karen had not challenged the installation because doing so would have meant acknowledging that it was legal. More importantly, she would have had to explain why it had affected her so viscerally. The breakthrough came not through confrontation, but through bureaucracy, as it often does. A padded envelope arrived one morning from the city zoning records office in response to his FOIA request. Inside were 73 pages of internal memos, meeting summaries, and anonymized complaint logs relating to Lot 27B, his property. At first glance, it was standard procedural filler, timestamps, complaint summaries, vague phrases like excessive non-standard activity, failure to maintain visual conformity, and non-compliant personal landscaping. But Reuben read every page, cataloged the dates, cross-referenced them with his own timeline of events, and then he found it. Tucked within a block of copied meeting minutes was a note labeled Special Concerns Session, July, a non-public council meeting summary with only partial attendance. There, in plain terms, was a discussion that mentioned his fire circle by name, Lawson's Burn Pit, and detailed proposed options for quiet removal through authorized landscape channels, followed by a note reading, "No need for formal review, proceed," under Visual Consistency Clause. The initials K.A. appeared beside that final line. Karen Ashley. Reuben leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that confirmation settle in. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't deduction. It was documented, archived proof that Karen had not only targeted his property, but had done so through back-channel discussions, skirting all official mechanisms. They hadn't followed protocol. They had written around it. This changed everything. He didn't call anyone. He didn't write angry letters or schedule meetings. Instead, he made a single visit to a small firm downtown specializing in administrative ethics and procedural misconduct. The firm didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Its clients were typically professionals who needed problems handled without headlines. Reuben submitted the documents, paid a confidentiality retainer, and outlined his objectives clearly. He wasn't suing yet. He wasn't seeking money. What he wanted was leverage. confirmation that the council's actions could be formally reviewed by the city's ethics board if they overstepped again. The firm agreed and promised to issue a summary advisory within 2 weeks. That was the first move. The second came that weekend when Rubin walked into the District Development Forum, an open Q&A session hosted by local planning officials and, occasionally, district committee members. It was sparsely attended, mostly filled with retirees asking about street lamp replacements or dog park regulations. But Rubin didn't attend to ask anything. He attended to listen, and to be seen listening. Karen arrived halfway through, and their eyes met briefly across the room. She did not sit near him. At the end of the meeting, Rubin approached the microphone under the guise of a general comment. He praised the city's transparency initiatives. He thanked the planning office for the timely response to his zoning request. He mentioned, casually, politely, that he had received unexpected clarity on several recent neighborhood matters, and that he was grateful the city's records allowed residents to understand the decision-making process in such depth. He didn't name Karen. He didn't mention the fire circle, but he didn't need to. Karen stood 3 rows back, her expression unreadable. Afterward, as Rubin exited the hall, a man in a navy sweater with a clipboard approached him and quietly asked if he would be open to providing feedback on his recent interactions with the Beautification and Compliance Council. The man identified himself as a civic auditor. Not officially, not yet, but contracted through a municipal oversight program reviewing suburban governance structures. Rubin nodded and offered his contact information without hesitation. He had entered the forum alone and left it with a signal. The city was watching now, even if passively. That was enough. Back at home, the atmosphere had shifted. No more unannounced visits, no strange technicians, no new flyers. It was too quiet again, but now it was reactive. Karen wasn't retreating. She was waiting, planning, and Rubin was doing the same. That night, he stood by the remnants of his original fire circle and imagined, not the next act of confrontation, but the next precision incision, something that wouldn't just challenge their rules, but expose how hollow they had become when pushed, just slightly outside the boundaries of fear. He wasn't trying to win. He was redefining the field. The absence of conflict in the weeks that followed did not feel like resolution. It felt like the stillness of air before a structural collapse. Rubin knew that power, when challenged publicly and not immediately restored, became unstable, twisting, hardening, seeking any path to reassert itself. What he had done at the development forum hadn't just disrupted Karen Ashley's authority, it had punctured the illusion that the council operated with unassailable legitimacy. He had shown, without theatrics or legal bombast, that the emperor wore no robes, only procedural arrogance and inherited control. The reaction, when it came, was not theatrical. It was surgical. It began with the trash. The bins he placed, as always, at the edge of his property on collection day were left untouched while the rest of the street was cleared. No note. No citation. Just his garbage, sitting there like an accusation. The following week, the same happened again, but this time with an orange tag on the handle. Non-compliant disposal positioning. Correct by next collection or receive administrative notice. Rubin photographed the bin from 3 angles, overlaid the measurements with GIS data showing the exact placement aligned with district requirements, and submitted it with a query to sanitation services. He received a canned response 2 days later. Service delay due to route adjustment. Please continue using designated collection location. No mention of the tag, no correction. The next move was less passive. A week later, he came home to find the strip of land between his sidewalk and the street, property technically belonging to the city but maintained by him, completely dug up. The soil was overturned, the grass gone, and 4 small holes marked by orange flags cut into the earth. A work order stapled to a post claimed the area was being prepped for a tree replacement project. No one had asked him. No public notice had been made. When he called the urban forestry office listed on the paper, the woman on the phone hesitated for just a second too long before saying, "That shouldn't be scheduled for your block." She promised to follow up. She never did. The following morning, a contractor showed up with a backhoe and a truck filled with young maple saplings. Reuben stood in front of the machinery and asked for credentials. The man on site gave a name and company that Reuben recognized. Local, reputable, often subcontracted by the council. When pressed, the worker became agitated and said, "We got clearance. If there's a problem, take it up with Karen." Then he stepped back into the cab. Reuben didn't block them. He simply asked for the site supervisor, documented the name badge, and left a message with the city clerk's office detailing unauthorized land work pending clarification. Then he went inside and activated his audio log system, carefully capturing the sound of every mechanical movement, every rusted groan of the backhoe, every slap of a spade against fresh dirt. He wasn't surprised when 3 days later the trees were planted, but the soil was uneven, and the border fence had been moved 2 inches back. He measured it with a laser level. That 2-inch shift wasn't random. It moved the edge of his property inward. It redefined the boundary by implication. He didn't respond in kind. Instead, he printed enlarged copies of the county parcel map and mailed them, annotated in red, to both the contractor's parent company and the local councilman's office, with a calm request for clarity regarding municipal landscaping boundaries and unauthorized alteration of soil on private residential lots. He CC'd the municipal auditor and his legal advisor. 2 days later, the trees were removed. No apology, no explanation. The earth remained torn. Reuben began to notice new people walking the neighborhood. People who didn't live there. Not delivery drivers, not joggers. Men with clipboards or dogs they didn't seem comfortable walking, always taking slow, observational passes along his block. At first, it was once a day, then twice, then more frequent. They never looked directly at him, but they looked at his house, his driveway, his side yard. He logged every one of them: time, appearance, direction of travel, clothing, estimated age. Each became another line in the growing dossier he kept encrypted in a drive inside his HVAC system. And then, as he knew it eventually would, it moved inside. Late one Thursday afternoon, Reuben arrived home to find his front door slightly ajar. There were no signs of forced entry. No glass broken. The smart lock showed a correct code entry. His code. But he hadn't used it that day. He kept a secondary motion alert embedded inside the doorframe. Not networked, not digital, purely analog. The thread had been broken. He stepped inside with practiced calm and noted 3 things immediately. The rug near the entryway was misaligned by 3 inches. The hallway light was on when he always kept it off, and a notepad he kept near the kitchen for grocery lists was missing. Not disturbed. Gone. He didn't panic. He didn't call the police. Instead, he checked the decoy wallet he kept in the junk drawer. Still there. Same with the inert USB he'd planted in the living room as bait. Whoever had entered wasn't looking for valuables or hardware. They were checking for presence, vulnerability, perhaps leverage, a reminder that they could. That night, he slept in the garage. The next morning, he replaced all the locks, reset the garage code, and placed a new analog perimeter wire at each entry point. He didn't leave his property for 3 days. He waited. He monitored. Nothing more happened. Until the meeting invitation arrived. It was printed, not emailed, heavy paper, formal layout. Special session, district advisory gathering. Idon topic. Reinforcement of visual cohesion and behavioral standards. Karen Ashley's name appeared at the bottom, along with the phrase, "Open floor, resident contributions encouraged." It was scheduled for the upcoming Saturday. Unusual day. Unusual format. Reuben knew exactly what it was. A trap dressed as a forum. A staged confrontation with pre-selected witnesses, carefully guided statements, and a subtle but aggressive effort to force a public reaction from him. A cornering. He RSVP'd attending. But before the meeting, he made a delivery of his own. 2 hours before the session began, he placed a structure at the driveway entrance of the community hall, not in the way of traffic, not blocking the entrance, just placed precisely at the merge between municipal sidewalk and private venue lot. It was an elevated ring, identical in diameter to the original fire circle they had removed, made of blackened concrete and ash-treated steel. Inside the ring was a compressed, hardened composite of recycled brick, wood, and garden soil, non-flammable, inert. From the center, a cold vapor mist system gently exhaled a low fog, illuminated from beneath by orange and red LEDs. No heat, no fire, nothing to sight. Beside it stood a placard. This is what you removed. This is what you created. He didn't wait by it. He entered the meeting room and sat in the back row. The room filled slowly. More people than usual. Karen stood near the podium, carefully scanning the attendees. She spoke first, delivering a speech about consistency of spirit, about maintaining traditions, and the importance of mutual understanding between residents and those tasked with ensuring the district remains a sanctuary of respect and balance. It was carefully worded, legally hollow, emotionally weighted. Then came the floor contributions. They began with a man complaining about parking overflow near the community garden, then a woman talking about late-night noise near the basketball courts, and then, predictably, a segue. Karen turned, face practiced, and said, "Reuben Lawson, would you like to share your thoughts?" The room turned. Reuben stood, calm, neutral. "I appreciate the invitation. I'll be brief. I've learned much about this neighborhood in the last 2 months. I've watched how we speak of unity while practicing coercion. I've experienced how decisions are made without process, how rules are applied unevenly, and how dissent is not met with dialogue but with sabotage. I won't belabor the point. I just want you to know that I understand now." He looked directly at Karen. "I understand what this is, and what it isn't." Then he left. Outside, the mist ring still pulsed gently. Someone had moved closer. A young couple took a photo. He didn't need them to understand everything. Just enough. The escalation was no longer a contest. It had become a study in control. The silence that followed the meeting was more telling than any statement made during it. No more notes. No more flyers. No surveillance walkers. Not even the usual staged infractions designed to bait Reuben into reaction. It was as if the very air of the neighborhood had contracted, sucked inward, waiting for a breath that would never quite arrive. The spectacle he had engineered at the community center hadn't just provoked discomfort. It had thrown the entire ecosystem off balance. That mist ring, cool and silent, had done something Karen never anticipated. It turned the aesthetic of control back on itself. It revealed how absurd their regulations became when reflected with equal polish and precision. How vulnerable their power was when exposed in front of the very people whose compliance they relied on. And it had left Karen without recourse. No way to condemn it without acknowledging what they'd done to him first. But Reuben knew the most dangerous moment in any campaign wasn't the first blow. It was the moment after you've landed a clean hit, and the enemy, injured and humiliated, retreats into stillness. Because that stillness isn't peace. It's planning. 3 nights after the meeting, around 1:15 a.m., the perimeter wire in his rear garden broke again. The signal was faint, brief, no repeated steps, just a single pressure event near the fence line, and then nothing. Reuben didn't go outside. He checked the time, marked it in his log, and waited. The next morning, he did a perimeter sweep. Nothing missing, no damage, no broken locks, but someone had been there. He found faint impressions in the soil near his irrigation pump, and one of his driveway lights had been removed from its base and placed, not broken, but turned upside down. As before, it wasn't vandalism. It was communication. Reuben no longer questioned why. They were trying to provoke him into an overstep, something they could weaponize. But what they didn't understand, what Karen especially had never understood, was that Reuben didn't believe in escalation for escalation's sake. He believed in extraction, of control, of weakness, of the exact moment when the system revealed its own fractures. So he gave them nothing. Instead, he turned to his documentation. The folder he had kept encrypted and offline since the first week now had everything: time-coded photos, audio logs, emails, forged removal orders, inconsistencies in maintenance records, proof of selective enforcement, and, most damning, the city. Documents showing non-existent public approvals for the work done to his fire circle. He compiled it all into a non-narrative format. Not an accusation, just a factual timeline. Then, on the following Monday, he emailed a single link to a compressed read-only file to the Regional Municipal Ethics Board, attaching a short message. This may be of interest in reviewing the actions of your contracted residential compliance committee for the North Willow District. No immediate action requested. Transparency appreciated. He CC'd no one. He didn't need to. The file alone was an iceberg. Its implications reached not only into Karen's actions, but into the lazy oversight of the Advisory Council, the abuse of contractor access, and the artificial structure of governance they'd built on informal intimidation. And if the board had any intention of continuing to ignore what had happened, that decision would now become a documented liability. 3 days passed. Then something shifted. Residents began receiving notices, strange, vague communications from the city, requesting input about governance satisfaction, perceived procedural integrity, and general council accessibility. The emails were short surveys, but they were clearly not initiated by Karen or the council. They were city standard templates. The board had started digging. Quietly, yes, but deliberately. Karen responded as he expected. 2 days after the surveys went out, Reuben woke to find a small yellow placard stuck into his front yard, barely visible from the street. Pending violation. External nonconformity under review. It wasn't legal. It wasn't even logged, but it was enough to raise questions. Neighbors began walking slower past his home again, pausing longer at the edge of the driveway. One woman even asked him, cautiously, if they were shutting him down. He smiled politely and told her everything was in order. But inside, he felt the engine shifting. Karen was getting desperate. The following Saturday, he received a hand-delivered letter from a private legal office in town, alleging that his mist-ring installation constituted a public safety hazard and a misrepresentation of city endorsement. The letter demanded its removal within 72 hours or face civil complaint. Reuben responded in 12. He delivered a package, hand-carried, notarized, to the same legal office. It included certification of non-combustibility, design diagrams, power usage reports, permits for temporary exhibition space, and email threads with municipal event coordinators who had confirmed there was no policy against decorative displays in the community lot. He included, without commentary, 2 sworn statements from witnesses at the meeting confirming there had been no obstruction or complaint at the time of display. He never heard back. But something in Karen finally cracked. That Tuesday night, shortly before midnight, Reuben received an anonymous voicemail. The voice was a man's, strained, barely above a whisper. They're going to try something with your foundation. Check the Southeast. Before the end of the week. No number, no return call, just the message. Reuben listened to it once, then again. He didn't recognize the voice. He checked the audio logs and ran a partial waveform comparison against the few male speakers he'd archived from prior council meetings. One hit came back close, an assistant facilities coordinator who had stopped returning Karen's calls last month. It didn't matter. The warning was enough. At dawn, Reuben walked the perimeter. The southeast corner of the house backed into a small slope, barely visible from the street. As he examined the soil near the irrigation access, he noticed a newly patched section of concrete, fresh but painted to look aged. His boot pressed into it slightly, and the surface gave way more than it should have. He ran his hand along the edge and found a hairline crack. Someone had been there. He called a structural inspector, independent, not district-affiliated. The man arrived the same afternoon, performed a sonar sweep, and confirmed what Reuben had suspected. Someone had cut into the irrigation runoff trench and inserted a makeshift clog. Over time, it would have forced moisture back into the slab. Structural degradation in under 6 months. Sabotage. Reuben paid the inspector in cash, asked for a typed summary, and sent a single message to the municipal auditor who had first contacted him after the development forum. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He simply forwarded the inspection summary with the subject line, "Pattern emerging." Requesting documentation of district-sponsored trench work approvals, Southeast Quadrant. The response came 3 hours later. "We're sending a review team this week. Please make yourself available Thursday, 10 a.m. No explanation, no denial, just action. By Thursday, 3 people stood in his driveway. 1 municipal investigator, 1 structural assessor from the city's independent panel, and, surprisingly, an assistant city attorney. Reuben gave them access, showed them the trench. Provided copies of all documents without commentary. They said very little, took photos, measured, left. That night, an internal memo from the City Ethics Board leaked online. Reuben didn't post it. He didn't have to. Someone within the system had had enough. The memo didn't name Karen, but it referenced recurrent procedural circumvention, inconsistent enforcement patterns, and escalatory behaviors displayed by advisory figureheads resulting in liability exposure. Karen didn't appear in public for days, but Reuben knew she wasn't finished. People like her never are, not until they're removed or replaced, and he wasn't finished either. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, it had a clock. The collapse, when it came, was not cinematic. It did not arrive with handcuffs or press conferences or shouted confessions. It arrived instead with silence, a change in the energy of the neighborhood, a shift in how people walked, how they looked at Reuben's house. There were no more stares, no more curious glances through car windows. The conversations at street corners turned quiet when he passed, not out of disdain, but uncertainty. People who had aligned themselves with power now unsure of where that power stood. And Karen Ashley was nowhere to be seen. The city's review team returned twice over the following week, this time without warning and without Reuben's prompting. They knocked, they photographed, they took soil samples near the trench and asked neutral, almost perfunctory questions. The second visit lasted longer, and when they left, Reuben noticed something for the first time. One of them nodded to him with what looked like approval, the nod of someone who knew he hadn't escalated to destroy, but had exposed just enough to make the system move. And now it was moving, grinding forward under its own momentum. 3 days later, a formal notice was distributed to all district residents. It was clinical, printed on city letterhead, and devoid of emotion. In accordance with municipal ethics protocol, The North Willow Beautification and Compliance Advisory Committee will be temporarily suspended pending full procedural audit. All current committee actions and enforcement measures are to be placed on hold. Oversight will be assumed by interim municipal liaisons until reformation is complete. There were no names, but none were needed. Karen's control, at least in its current form, was over. The following morning, Reuben received an envelope in his mailbox, hand-delivered, with no stamp or return address. Inside was a short note in blue pen. "You didn't burn it down. You just let the wind blow through. Thank you, no signature." But Reuben recognized the handwriting. It was Troy Denslow, the quiet man who had first spoken out months ago. Reuben didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He folded the letter, placed it in his drawer, and went outside to rake his front path, just as he had done every week since he moved in. That afternoon, a city truck arrived and removed the yellow violation placard from his yard. No explanation. Just a gloved hand, lifting the sign from the earth and driving away. A week later, the council held a neighborhood meeting, not at the community center, but on neutral ground, in a rented hall downtown. It was chaired by a temporary liaison from the city's Civic Integration Office. The meeting was calm, almost surreal. Residents were encouraged to speak openly about concerns, and many did, carefully but honestly. A few brought up the arbitrary rule enforcement. Others referenced things that had happened to them: garden removals, unauthorized visits, unexplained billing for landscaping adjustments. One man stood and said he never wanted a fire circle, but that Reuben's wasn't the problem. The silence around it had been. There was no cheering, no rally. Just quiet acknowledgement that something toxic had been embedded in the way they lived, and now, perhaps, it could be cut out. Karen did not attend. She was not mentioned, and no one asked why. Reuben did not speak. He sat in the back of the room, listening, tracking the cadence of accountability returning to the space. And for the first time since this began, he let his guard down, just slightly. When he returned home that evening, he walked to the back of his property and stood in the center of the scarred space where the first fire circle had been. The soil had settled. The grass had tried to grow back, but the outline remained, like a memory carved into the ground. He hadn't rebuilt it. Not yet. But now, he saw the value in restoring, not as a challenge, but as closure. Over the next week, he began to work again. Quietly, not for attention, not for revenge. He reshaped the circle with new stone, laid the foundation more deeply this time, used reinforced gravel and tempered glass. The structure rose slowly, methodically, until one evening, under a windless sky, Reuben lit it. No crowd gathered.